Hey.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Oh, hold on. My mute was on.
Uh-oh. Oh, there's my sister. Let's see, what is this thing? Yeah.
My hair is so long, there's not a lot I can do with it except put it in the trenza now.
So cute.
Thanks. I was like, I'm going back to the braid.
Yeah. That's cool. Yeah. Let's see if Audrey pops in here.
I like your sweatshirt.
Oh, thanks.
Represent. Hi, Audrey.
How are you both doing?
Good.
Awesome.
It's my time of year. The house is all either Halloween or Dia de Muerto up.
I love it. I love it. Oh my gosh, I know it's already October.
I know. This weekend I'll be fixing up the ofrenda, but because I have a really big armoire from Mexico, and that's where it sits. So I kidded my husband. I said, "I'm glad that you weren't freaked out by all the skulls and stuff because it's not his culture. He's Canadian."
Okay. Excellent.
He was like, "Oh, I like it. It makes sense." And it was so sweet to me the first time he asked me to put his grandfather like on the ofrenda. I was like, "Oh."
It's awesome.
So yeah, it's also that time of year when I have to constantly be explaining that it's not Mexican Halloween.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right, we're going to get started in like a minute, right?
Yeah.
Excellent. I'm excited.
Okay, cool. Should we get started? It's 11:15.
Yeah, definitely. All right. Well, welcome everybody. This is our session called Por Nosotros y por Ellos, Healing from Generational Burnout. We're going to start with just some brief introductions of who we are. So I'll get started first. My name is Audrey Gallo. My pronouns are she, her, ella. And I wear a couple different hats. I'm showing up here in the Techqueria space as a founder of a company called AG Voice, where we focus on closing the opportunity gap, in particular for women of color. So I'm a career coach, career strategist, sometimes a quasi-therapist, because our careers are challenging, they're difficult, and we know that systemic barriers are put in place that prevent us from succeeding and reaching our goals. So that is really my purpose, and also just elevating the voices and experiences of people who share some of the identities that I have. So being queer, being a woman, being Latina, being a parent, a mom for the first time, and so forth and so on. So I'm here to just share what I know and to connect with all of you. So I'll pass it on to Carol.
Hi, everybody. My name's Carol Mansour. I also have a million jobs, but today I'm going to be sharing some of my background and knowledge from where my education space. So I was a teacher for 7 years, and now I am an adjunct, and I teach within a teacher ed department. And I also work in ed tech as a customer success associate. So I'm happy to kind of merge these worlds and share my knowledge and expertise coming from education and really looking at how to create inclusive environments and merge that into tech. And I'll pass it on to Marissa.
Hi, I'm Marisa Elena Gomez Palmer. So I don't put the whole thing in, it'll take up all the bottom. I am a cybersecurity professional for a fintech company. I also am on the board of a non-for-profit called Latinitas, where we introduce young girls of color to tech and media spaces and have a whole bunch of programs. That's a real important part of giving back to the community and being engaged at an early point in young Latinos and Latinas lives. My pronouns are she, her, ella. Excited to be here and speak to everyone about this really important topic.
Cool. So I can take it from there to share a little bit about our intention for our session today. I also forgot to share my pronouns, which are she, her. But I wanted to take this time to do a little land acknowledgement. I think from wherever you are tuning in from, I wanted to take this space in solidarity with the Indigenous peoples' continued struggle to regain sovereignty and restore land rights that were brutally taken in our country's history through colonialism. And I think for Latinx people, as people of the Americas, North, Central, and South, we know the ways in which colonialism still has an impact today. So with that, I wanted to invite you all to acknowledge the land that you are residing and tuning in from today. I wanted to share a link in the chat and invite you to search up what Indigenous land you are residing in. I am currently in Richmond, California, which is Ohlone land. And I invite you to share what land you are tuning in from in the chat. And I think with that, we can move on to our first focus point today.
So I'm going to be taking the first focus point and kind of explain a little bit. I think a lot of us have heard these terms, but there's a lot of interchangeable terms when we're talking about generational burnout. You may have heard transgenerational trauma. Trauma is another aspect of this. Intergenerational trauma, historic trauma. It all leads to a type of burnout. And they are unique if you want to go research a little bit more about those different aspects. And I'm not going to go into that. But I do want to touch upon the point that what we're talking about is that this isn't something that's unique to the Latinx experience. It goes across all different ethnic groups. But we're speaking specifically about the transgenerational, intergenerational trauma that happens and the burnout that's happening with Latinxes. Particularly if you are the child of an immigrant or an immigrant, I think that it's even doubled more because there's a lot more layers to this. So what we're talking about is any type of traumatic event that happens that isn't dealt with by one generation, that being like a parent or a grandparent generation, and it transmits to the next generation. And this happens in a lot of different ways. And there's lots of different models. There's a psychodynamic model, a biological model, of ways that it happens. But I'm going to make it really kind of simple, and I'm going to oversimplify. So apologies to anybody who likes the technical. I like the technical too, but to oversimplify, what we have is how it's transmitted is through either silence, like that generation doesn't speak or transmit anything to the next one, through selective disclosure. So there's just certain things, so you don't get the full story. And then it's going to sound like there's no way to win. Over disclosure. Over disclosure, you know, you have to think about it from a parent-child perspective. There's things you shouldn't be disclosing to children at certain ages and development stages. So the over disclosure can happen a lot, particularly with children of parents who have immigrated, and there is a language barrier because it's the child who usually carries the burden of being the interpreter. So then there's an over disclosure, an overwhelming sense of knowing the finances, the struggles, all of these things that, a child usually doesn't know, isn't aware of. And these things all have a tendency to show up for us in different ways. And I'm going to name a couple of the ways that these symptoms of this type of burnout and trauma show up. And it's going to be, some of them are really scary, and some of them you're going to be like, oh, whoa, that might be me. Denial, depersonalization, isolation, memory losses or nightmares, a hypervigilance, like always waiting for something bad to happen. I know that happens a lot here. Substance abuse of any time, identification with death or any unresolved grief. So these are some really big, heavy things that show how it's transmitted down. And it's layered, right? It's multi-layered. So if your grandparents didn't deal with something, they passed it on. And as Carol said about the colonization, that's something that hasn't ever been dealt with. So it's just been coming down to each of us. And one of the things that's really important to remember that is so important is, if one generation doesn't try to stop and recognize the trauma and try to heal from this trauma, then it's absolutely inevitable that you will transmit it unconsciously, subconsciously, to your children or to whatever children you're around and to other members of your family. So we're trying to kind of start that process of recognizing and healing. And, we think a lot. We have to remember that we were taught a lot to survive, not to question, not to rock the boat, to blend. And I like to say that, and that's very important, right? It's very important to survive. But many of us are moving into different socioeconomic groups, different tiers of the community, and different areas in academia and in corporate world. And the same rules don't apply. It's a different set. And so we have to find a way to move from a survival model to a thrive model so that we can start doing better, not only for ourselves, but for those who come after us, for our children, for our families, for our community. And it's kind of a hard thing to do, because you hear a lot, and I'm going to speak from personal experience here. You hear a lot about self-care. And personally, from my upbringing, this sounds really selfish. Like I go, oh man, I'm supposed to take that much time. No, I'm supposed to help the family. I'm supposed to help out here. It's not something that I was taught. I think that probably resonates with a lot of Latinos. You're taught to put the family first. So self-care can feel selfish. But it's not. And that's part of that mindset we have to change. We have to realize that if we don't care properly for ourselves, then we are going to care improperly for the generations behind us in our community. And we can do that by tapping into our actual cultural wealth, which Carol is going to speak to us more about. But I just wanted to kind of lay the groundwork as to what we're experiencing, and to put it in the context of, our modern world. So a lot of folks, I'm sure, work in tech. I do. And there's this tendency to not ever turn down work, not say no, because it's that survival model. And in that, we're underselling ourselves, right? We're underselling ourselves. We're doing the work that, like, we're taught from our parents, that you don't turn down work, you do the work. But we're doing work that may be several pay grades beneath us or beneath our skill set, and that's not elevating us and allowing us for more growth and opportunity. So we're getting burned out by a whole bunch of busy work that isn't advancing us, and it's mentally exhausting, and you'll feel the physical repercussions. So we definitely need to tap, and the pandemic hasn't helped, right? It's made us all a little bit more tired. So now's the time to try and heal from that. So I'm going to pass it on to Carol now, and we'll chime in as we go through this.
Nice. Thank you, Marissa, for sharing that and putting it so cohesively for us. Definitely, I can see in the chat a lot. This is resonating with a lot of people, and definitely with my own experience and my own story and professional life. When we were doing this presentation, we wanted to make sure that we were intentional of not stopping the conversation right there and just leaving you with everybody feels burnt out. So we wanted to share a framework with all of you. And I don't know how to share on here. Do either of you two know how to share? I couldn't find anything that said share my screen. But I will share the link in the chat. And if anybody figures out how to share and they want to tell me, great. But on the second slide, you'll see what we have there is an image diagram of community cultural wealth. And this is a model that comes from education. This was actually created by Dr. Tara Yoso. And this whole thing comes from her work with young people of color in schools. And the story behind it has to do a lot with, if you've ever been in schools or working with young people applying to college, if you've worked in Title I schools, you're familiar with that, where it's low income. A lot of the times these students are told, tell them how poor you are. Tell them like that you have all these things against you and that you need this ticket. And Dr. Teriosa was like, no, tell them how great you are because of all these things, because you're first generation, here, or because you're a child of immigrants, or because you have this, history. So that's kind of where this framework comes from. And so what she has here are six different areas of cultural wealth. We have linguistic, aspirational, familial, navigational, resistance, and social. And all of these are kind of speaking to different assets that students bring. So we're thinking from an asset-based perspective and really trying to reframe that even though we do come from this history of colonialism, which is very much alive today in the ways that it impacts Latinx folks here in the US, we also have these gifts that we've inherited also. And I think it is great to use a framework like this to really figure out what it is that's going to serve you. So much for what Marissa was sharing. Self-care is not like a package thing that works for everybody that you can, just buy at the store and you're good to go, or you can buy a program online and you're good to go. It's going to be specific to your needs. And so really understanding who you are and really identifying those assets is going to be you tapping into your own agency and you being able to really access that power that you carry. No one's going to hand it to you. You already have it, pretty much is what the cultural wealth model says. It's you already have it. Like, please share it with us because we want to see you shine. So we do want to have some time to share a little bit about our experiences and how we've kind of used this different model, or how our experiences fit within this model. So I'm going to pass it on to Audrey to share this next piece that we're going to move into.
Yes. Thank you so much, Carol and Marissa. I think what a great way to lay the foundation. And want to really thank Carol for bringing this model to our attention, the cultural wealth model. And if you look in the chat, Carol shared a couple of slides where you can see what we're talking about here. And want to shift before we get to Q&A, so pop your questions into the Q&A. Wanted to just talk a little bit about how that cultural wealth model shows up in our lives. So I'm going to invite Marissa and Carol to share as well. But I'll kick things off in the sense that, there are these attributes that, I always knew I had because of the experiences I had, growing up and with my family. My parents are immigrants from Central America, from Guatemala and Honduras. And the way that we grew up, I was happy. I was confident. I knew that I was gaining these incredible life skills, and I could sort of compare myself to other people. But I think the sort of resounding narrative around me was like, oh, you're less than, or you're at a disadvantage because you didn't have this sort of normal upbringing or whatever normal meant. So looking at the cultural wealth model for me, I see things like, the navigational capital, right? And it's kind of what Marissa was talking about. Like, I really can understand an institution because those are things that we had to navigate, right? We had to figure out, like, can my older sister get money for college? Like, she's the first one going to college. And it was like a family affair, right? All of us were like, okay, how do we get, older sister into college? How do we get our money, right? It was really us, as a family trying to, trudge that journey together. And then we did it for my brother and we did it for me, right? And it got a little easier. And then I made sure I helped other people navigate that process because I was like, start here, look for these scholarships, do this thing, right? And knowing that resourcefulness, that ability to say, like, I'm going to figure out this problem and I'm going to be unstoppable in trying to find a solution is part of why I've been successful in my career. It's part of why people, look to me to solve problems. It's actually a really great source of strength and accomplishment, right? It's part of like a toolbox that I'm really lucky to have. And so really seeing this model kind of show up in that way is helpful. And on the other front, I think what has resonated a lot with me with what Carol and Marissa shared is that there is also a lot of sort of unfinished work that prevents me from taking steps forward, right? Doing things that I know are in my best interest, in the interest of my family and my community, but I really can't step away from thinking like, oh, I need to take every job opportunity, every contract, because it's going to go dry, right? Like I'm not going to have opportunities in the future. That's survivalism, right? Instead of thinking, and that's a scarcity mindset, right? That there's not enough. And instead thinking like, no, I'm laying down the foundation to continue this success, right? I can say no to things. I can take time to rest and to, improve myself to then be better and show up better in the spaces that I'm in. But that is a really hard thing still for me to do, and a constant reminder that I really struggle with, saying no and putting those guards up. I know some of you talked about boundaries in the chat. That is a sure sort of challenge for me. So I'd love to invite Carol and Marissa to also share a little bit of how this cultural wealth model has come up in their lives. And then we'll get to some Q&A questions, I think.
Yeah, I think that's great, Audrey, and thank you for that. I also noted, like, when you were talking about that scarcity model, that's the hypervigilance that we were talking was symptomatic, right? Because what if it all dries up? There's several instances where this cultural wealth model, I didn't realize at the time, was a real source of strength for me to ground myself. When I grew up in Texas, so I had a lot of my culture around me all the time in my family. And then I moved away to New York City, and it was culture shock for a lot of different reasons. But there weren't a lot of my Latin background is Mexicana and Tejana. And so over there, it's not the same. It's more Puerto Rican, Dominican. Those are the prevalent Latinx cultures that you see in New York. And so nobody knew what I was. And when I would speak to somebody in Spanish who was speaking Spanish, they'd look at me weird and they'd immediately tell me, "You're not Dominican. You're not Puerto Rican. You know, what the hell are you?" So I was like, and it made me ask that question, what am I? And one of the things that I leaned into, like what I think of as a resistance model is, for me, Day of the Dead was something that was very important, but it was something that we couldn't celebrate once we started to move into different cities and even different neighborhoods, because it would have been too weird, right? It would have been scary to mainstream. What do you mean you go to a cemetery and you celebrate? It's hard to imagine now, but I remember my grandmother telling me about this and having the offer and the ofrenda to remember our ancestors. And it's very much, Day of the Dead is very much is almost like an exercise in indigenous resistance, because it's not necessarily, they've aligned it with religion now to maintain it, but it is something that's been practiced for literally a millennium by our indigenous ancestors from that region. And so I found myself, doing my ofrenda in New York City in a little bit of whatever space I had. And it kept me grounded. And I think I was sharing with Carol the other day, I remember asking for time off on Halloween so that I could get ready to get the ofrenda ready, and asking for it as a cultural holiday. And my boss, who was a white woman, very blatantly said, "Oh, that's made up. You just made that up. That's not real." And I was just like, what do I do? Nobody here in this space understands me. But it was okay, because I understood who I was, and I identified with that. And so I held really closely to that. And also the linguistic, capital, right? Because that's how I was trying to make connections with other Latinxes that I was seeing. It was a little bumpy, but eventually they're like, "Oh, okay, so we haven't seen a lot of you around here." But these things helped me create community. They helped me keep a sense of self and kept me grounded, and they helped me heal. Even to this day, my family is a source of strength. I don't want people to misunderstood what I was saying before, is that the family is just transmitting all this trauma down to you. They don't know. They can't help what they've experienced. They're trying to do the best they can, but they're also that source of strength for you, or they can be in many instances. And for me, I don't know where I would be without that cultural wealth.
Great. Thank you, Marissa, for sharing that. Yeah, a little bit about me. As you can all see, I'm Salvadorian. I had to wear my sweater to represent. And both my parents, they came to the U.S. during the war. So they were fleeing war. And I think that particularly has a impact on being a child of Salvadorian immigrants fleeing war. And similar to how Audrey and Marissa shared, it does kind of activate that, stress response and that scarcity mindset of that's what they live through, where one minute things seemed okay. Maybe there's a lot of oppression. That was the history of El Salvador. But then there was violence, and then things were very chaotic. And it was the same people within a country that were, slaughtering the citizens of that place. And so that was something that, even though I didn't live through it, that's something that impacted me, and always kind of thinking like, oh, well, I have to be ready, and I have to kind of just take everything, and almost living on alert, even though I never lived through war. So my sister and I were just sharing the other day, she's here too. Hi, sister. That, we both have graduate degrees, and just like my parents came here and they were struggling to like get whatever job they could, sometimes we still have that same energy of like, okay, like whatever's offered to us, we just need to take it because we don't know what's next. And so really kind of taking a step back to be able to see, to look at, you know, the opportunity that both of us have been able to have because of our parents coming here, because of not growing up during the war there, that gave us opportunity of like, okay, I can breathe. I can take a minute to breathe. I can say no to this thing and know that something, I'm making space. So instead of reframing it to not feel like, hey, I'm going to lose this opportunity and I'm going to be left with zero, but I'm actually making space for something that's better aligned for me. So I think that the capitals that really spoke to me on here was the social and familial, because I felt that that's something that I saw my family do too, reach out to other family that was here. You know, both my parents came with siblings, you know, where they tapped into other Central Americans or folks that were here to really tap into getting jobs and getting, you know, situated in the country. And so when I decided I wanted to leave teaching, I had to make a decision. I was scared. I thought everybody's going to be mad at me. They're going to say you're abandoning us, Carol. But no, like really tapping to my community, I got the opposite response. You know, folks were really supportive, like my family and like my peers and networks. Like folks were telling me like, oh, you know, I hear you. You know, I was burnt out. They were like, I hear you. Let me look out for postings. Like, I'll let you know if there's a job, or, you know, I'll put your name in for this. And so that's the way that I was able really to kind of maneuver into new spaces, and just really having that skill of knowing how valuable community is and tapping into like Techqueria and other communities in tech that are focused for folks of color. That was really like, I'm not just going anywhere, you know, if I'm going to be exploring in this place, like I need to make sure I'm tapped into community so I can feel supported and feel, you know, like I'm going into a place that can see me fully for who I am. So I'll leave it there. And I think we're going to move into some Q&A. Right, Audrey?
Yeah, we have one question here. So if you have more questions, please add them to the Q&A. But Oscar is asking, what are some good indicators that a community is healing or moving into a thriving model? How do we handle distributed communities being at different stages? Anyone want to take that one first?
Well, I think that's a great question. I don't think there's a simple answer. So one of the things that I used to do early in my career was I actually used to work in education, in public education, and I used to work with migrant students. And in Texas, there's certain states, as you know, that have more than others. And you see a lot of that survive mindset, right? And I understood exactly what they were dealing with. And one of the things, it's traumatic, right? When you move around a lot, it's for a kid, especially, right? You can't keep anything the same. You can't create a social network. And so I'm going to bring this down from a community level to an individual level. So I did a lot of counseling and therapy at that time, because that was kind of what my job required of me, because I had to be a counselor as well. And what this survive to thrive model is something that you see a lot with a lot of individuals who've had some sort of trauma or stress. And so, and it can be various different things. And on the individual level, what you find is that if it's a cycle of violence, they either perpetuate the cycle or they click into survival mode to keep ahead of it. And so if you're in survival mode, you don't ever know how to quite get out of it. So you just constantly, and it's almost like you create your own, what's normal for you, right? So if it's normal to just be constantly in a survival mode, constantly in panic mode, you almost create these situations, or you gravitate toward those situations because they feel normal. And so it's kind of hard. And what the individual needs to get to is through a thrive model, to get in front of and to stop reacting constantly, which is what that survival mode is, almost constantly reacting, and become more proactive. There's a lot of different things that go into that. There's therapy, and there's personal healing and identification of self. But you can see it start to happen in the individual as they start to I hate to say create boundaries, but part of it is the creation of boundaries, but it's also the letting go. It's like literally opening your hands and letting go of things that you cannot control, because that's what survival model kind of teaches you. You're trying to control everything, but you can't. And when the individual starts to let go, you start to see a mindset shift happen. It's very subtle at first, because I think, as Carol demonstrated, I also have a graduate degree. It didn't help me with that. It didn't help me get out of that survival mode. If anything, it made it worse because I was struggling, right? You have to see that shift of not always talking about the immediate self and the immediate family, and reaching out more into the community. I think that's when you can start to see, but it also has to happen at the individual level. And as it starts to happen at the individual level, you'll see it start to happen at the community level. But understanding that every community is always going to be at varying stages. It's just inevitable. Just like in a family, if you have a family that all experienced a really traumatic upbringing, each child is going to be at a different stage of development, because it's just so individualized. I don't know if that confused it or helped it.
Yeah, I wanted to add to that. I think that similar in this kind of idea of letting go, for me, like a sign that a community together is moving from like this survival kind of mentality into like healing and thriving, is trust. Like I feel that there's a lot of trust in the person. So that for me, if I'm in a community and I'm like going through it, if I really feel that person's trust, who I'm confiding in, that I'm going to be able to maneuver through this, and that they don't have to come in and save me or like, rescue me or control my situation, that to me feels very healing, because I feel that trust too. And I know that sometimes just having community there to witness whatever kind of is surfacing for me is very healing. I think similar in the distributed kind of just having folks at different stages, I think is really helpful, because you kind of see if you're maybe not where you want to be yet, but you're part of a community where you have folks that are, it's kind of something to aspire to, or something for you to see that it can happen. And similar, if you're part of a community where you're either, in community with folks who aren't exactly in the same place where you are, just being yourself, I think, is very healing for folks around you. And just, you don't have to tell them, hey, you need to be where I am, but just watching you live and watching you thrive is inspiring to folks, and you're modeling it for them. There's this Baldwin quote, James Baldwin, that I really love from teaching about children, but I think this is true for just people in general, that children have never been very good at doing what as they're told, but they've never failed to imitate, and I think that's true, especially when we're young people, but when we're just in community with different types of people, it gives you an idea of what is possible, and it inspires you to kind of see other folks. So yeah, thank you for that question.
Yeah, I saw a question in the chat from Joe around what are some tools that we use to heal, not just for burnout, but beyond this. So maybe therapy, metaphors, podcast videos, etc. I can jump in on this one to start. And I would say that things that have really been helpful for me is just being, trying to be self-aware and knowing that this is something that I have to face as someone who's part of the Latino community, who's part of many other identities and communities, that if I want to see different results and outcomes for myself and for my immediate family, I have to do the work, right? Like, it's not just going to disappear or go away, because that's the denial piece that Marissa talked about. So I think being self-aware and saying, like, so why do I do that? Like, why is that my go-to reaction? Why is that my go-to response? Why is it that I'm always working later than everybody else? My goodness, like, why am I, what is happening? Why is it why is everything, occurring this way? And, there are some things that can be answered. There's some others that, it's just going to be the way they are. But in terms of understanding what your role is in it, and then asking, where did that come from, right? And this is what therapy can be really helpful, right? Having a professional help guide you through those questions and that self-reflection is really what therapy is about. And then providing you with tools, best practices and tools to help you figure out, okay, how can I maybe adapt that behavior or adapt a mindset that is going to give me a more kind of positive, constructive result for myself. So for me, it's really owning that, hey, this is something I have to do. I will say for me personally, a lot of this has come up as soon as I became a parent for the first time, because it was like an immediate realization of, this new human is going to do the things that I do, right? Which is exactly what Carol was talking about. I'm role modeling. So if I'm role modeling, being a survivor, working 24/7, stressing out, overcommitting, all the things that are kind of classic first generation, what do you think is going to happen to this new little human, right? They're going to think that's normal. So for me, this has really become, the past couple of years, something that's become a priority, because I realized like, I can't escape this, right? I'm literally part of the chain now, and I really need to figure out how I can make it a little bit better and a little easier for not just my child, but those around me, because I realize like I'm having an impact on them too, right? All this time. So having that ownership, I think, has been really helpful. And finding community, I'm really lucky to have, communities like Techqueria, and now Carol and Marissa, who I've like been lucky enough to meet through this topic. All of you who are here, like, I think that in itself of being like, wow, there are other people who are thinking those exact same things or going through those exact same things as I am, has been a relief, right? Because when we go to our workspaces and most sort of spaces out there in the world, we're the only ones, right? We stick out. And so it's hard to imagine that anyone could sort of relate to what I'm thinking and what I'm feeling, because that just doesn't happen that often, right? So I think creating a community of people who are trying to strive for that kind of health and progress is important, right? Surround yourself with people who are going to urge you towards something that's going to work better for you and improve your future. So I'll pass it along.
No, but I think that's great. I mean, that helps with the burnout, right? I mean, to find these safe spaces, to find these communities. I didn't even realize until I encountered an ERG or BRG, but a Latinos in Tech group when I was working at Verbo. I hadn't become aware of how much of myself I withheld from my workspace, how much of my authentic self I wasn't allowing to show. And all of a sudden, I was surrounded by people who had similar backgrounds and upbringings, and you could joke. And it was like being at a get together with my family. Ay, ¿qué está pasando? We're all just kind of joking. We're talking about the music. We're talking about the food. And it was so healing for me. It was like there was two Marisas. There was Marissa and there was Marisa, and they got to suddenly coexist. And that's why I believe in places like Techqueria and, other Latino professional groups, because it gives you that space to be your professional and your cultural self. That you shouldn't have to separate them, but I knew that where I was working at the time that I was working in, when I was in banking, I did kind of have to separate them. That's what I felt like. I couldn't bring my authentic self, and that's not healing at all.
Yeah, I also wanted to share that in the deck that I shared a little bit earlier, and I'll share the link again. We have some resources too that we listed out if you're interested in taking a peek at different resources that would be helpful for healing or kind of addressing generational trauma. For me personally, Therapy was really helpful. And I will say that specifically having a trauma-informed and intersectional therapist was really important, that understood that what I was experiencing was due to systemic oppression, and that there was different systems in place that had to do with what I was experiencing, and not just like, I have to figure it out by myself, which I think is a very kind of like Western idea. So I definitely recommend to kind of, in your search, if you are looking for a therapist, to keep that in mind. Books, I also love. I'm like a self-help junkie. I love self-help books. Have really been impactful for me too. I think the Four Agreements is one that was a really big one that impacted me. Mindfulness also, I think, was another big thing for me. I did like a year-long mindfulness program here in the Bay Area, and really started reading a lot of Thich Nhat Hanh's work, which around loving kindness and all that. And that was really helpful for me. Lots of podcasts, somatics, and really tapping into your body. I think that's kind of the big thing that I learned about. How do we're so in our Western culture, like in our minds, and I can live there, blank things out, have television just be in my head, but really trying to listen to what your body is telling you, I think, is super important. And I have some podcasts, we listed some that also talk about how to do that through somatics. So those are a few of the resources that I wanted to share with you all.
Awesome. I also, I know there's some good conversation and a lot of vulnerability in our chat as well, and just want to like hold space for that some of you, this might be bringing up a lot of feelings and emotions and realizations, and the thing that I also wanted to get back to that I know Marisa shared was just around like there's so much in kind of the mainstream right now that is like, take a bath, light a candle, take care of yourself. And those things are important. I don't want to minimize them, right? I mean, I love a good bath. All right. But it doesn't heal the things that we're talking about. All right. So, that might, having the room to, take a break and kind of break up your day and do things that feel good for you are really important. But there is definitely another layer underneath that, many layers underneath that, which is doing the hard work of understanding sort of the full context, and even context you might not even fully understand for yourself because you didn't live through it. That's what's so tricky about this, is that you've been passed on things that you weren't even there for. So how are you starting to unravel those things when you don't truly understand them? And so, to be frank, like going out and working out and lighting a candle and taking a bath aren't the things that are going to do that work. And so I just wanted to share that because for me, I always felt like advice from friends who maybe didn't understand this sort of context, they were always like, you just work too much. Like, you got to just take a break. Like, when's the last time you had a vacation? Or like, go work out, go for a run, do the stuff that you really like. And I'm like, I have been doing those things. They don't work. And so I think just knowing that this is a situation and an experience that's unique to us, and we really have to take care of ourselves. So I know we're reaching final time, so I'd love to ask you both to just share your final thoughts, and I want to say thank you, but I'll leave the floor to Carol and Marisa for final thoughts. You're muted, Marisa.
Uh-oh. Not sure what's happening. Yeah, but thank you everybody for being here. Appreciate folks sharing in the chat, and definitely stay in touch with us. I added the slide link again, and we have our little QR code so you can connect with us on LinkedIn through that way. So yeah, thank you for being so open and for taking this time with us.